Hello there and welcome. Tonight, allow me to gently guide you into the quieter shadows of history, where the hush of silk skirts is louder than any outcry, and sorrow is folded neatly behind palace walls. In these dim corridors of time, we will uncover the lives of imperial concubines in ancient China, women dressed in splendor, yet wrapped in silence. Their world was one of illusion, honor on the surface, heartbreak at its core. So make yourself cozy. Draw the blanket up to your chin, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's begin. It began with a scent, the faint perfume of osmanthus lingering in the morning air, drifting lazily over the roof tiles of the Forbidden City. Behind the vermilion walls, past golden lions and cold marble steps, a girl barely 17 stood with hands clasped in front of her, still and silent. Her name was Mei Ling. She was the daughter of a merchant. Not nobility, but her father had prospered enough to buy silk robes, to host poets, and most importantly, to offer his daughter to the palace with a sizable dowry. It had been called an honor. The emperor's ministers praised her beauty, noted her quiet demeanor, and smiled thinly as they enrolled her name on the palace scroll. Now she stood among dozens, no, perhaps hundreds of women, all chosen for the same fate. The Hall of Serene Flowers was the first stop. A vast chamber, dimly lit by slender lanterns, with carved screens dividing the space into private little cells. Each woman had her own space, a simple wooden cot, a cabinet for toiletries, a mirror, and a lacquered box for jewellery she might never wear. The eunuchs, tall and pale in their stiff robes, moved silently between the girls. They issued rules like breathing: do not speak loudly, never turn your back to a superior, smile, but not too eagerly, eyes low always. Mei Ling had never worn such fine clothes before. She had dreamed of them, certainly. Brocaded silk that shimmered in the light, gold-threaded slippers, hairpins shaped like phoenixes. But the weight of them surprised her. Every piece tugged at her, reminding her of the cost of beauty. Her old cotton dress had been light, forgiving. These garments were like chains. Meals were served with quiet elegance. Bowls of bird's nest soup, tiny dishes of sweet lotus seeds, steamed fish with ginger, all prepared to perfection. But appetite fled when your future was uncertain. The women rarely spoke. Words could be heard, words could be remembered. Silence was safer. Every morning began before dawn. A bell rang, low, mournful, and the women were up, bathed, dressed, combed and painted. Those whose names were listed for the morning inspection were arranged in rows along the hall. The emperor, they whispered, rarely came. It was his mother, the Empress Dowager, who watched from behind a screen, noting the curves, the smiles, the postures of girls who hoped or pretended to hope. Mei Ling was not chosen, not that week nor the next. Others were. One girl wept quietly behind a silk screen after being summoned. Another did not return for 3 days, and when she did, her face was pale and her gaze empty. Yet even the chosen were not safe. Favor was a fleeting breeze, barely enough to stir a curtain. One wrong word, one moment of jealousy, and a concubine could fall from grace like a leaf in autumn, silently, without notice and without a trace. There were ranks, names etched into bamboo plaques arranged by favour. The top few were bathed in gifts, fabrics, bracelets, servants, and rooms with heated floors. The rest lived in colder chambers, watching their silks fade, their youth slip quietly away. And always, the watching. The walls had ears. Every laugh, every sigh, every gaze was noticed. The older concubines kept ledgers, noted alliances, formed cliques. They bribed eunuchs for gossip, whispered poison into the ears of palace officials. A girl like Mei Ling, new and naive, was easy prey. One afternoon, as cicadas droned lazily in the garden, Mei Ling sat beneath a magnolia tree. She was alone, or thought she was. A soft rustle made her turn. It was Lady Huarong, elegant, composed, a senior consort known for her grace and charm. She smiled, eyes cool, lips painted a perfect red. "You are quiet," Lady Huarong said. Her voice was like velvet, smooth but unreadable. "Yes, my lady," Mei Ling replied, bowing. "You should be careful. Quiet girls are often forgotten." A gentle warning or a threat? Mei Ling could not tell. Lady Huarong extended a hand, palm up. "Come walk with me. I'll show you how to be remembered." And so Mei Ling followed her through a winding path lined with camellias, unaware she had taken her first step into the web of palace intrigue, where loyalty was currency, trust was fragile, and kindness often came with strings. As the sun slipped behind the crimson walls, casting long shadows across the pebbled courtyard, the air grew cooler. Mei Ling stood by her chamber window, staring out at the distant silhouette of the Hall of Supreme Harmony. Somewhere in that maze of gold and silence, the Emperor lived. But for her, and so many others, he remained a ghost. The palace was beautiful, impossibly so. But it was a beauty carved from sorrow. Behind every painted beam and carved lotus was a story of longing, betrayal, and quiet despair. And Mei Ling was beginning to learn that the hardest part of being a concubine wasn't the waiting, nor the cold. It was the pretending. Pretending you were grateful, pretending you were happy, pretending you mattered. The sun rose over the palace once more, casting a pale light across the latticework of the eastern chambers. A thin veil of mist lingered in the gardens, curling between the rocks like breath in the winter air. Mei Ling rose from her narrow bed as the morning bell rang low and steady, its echoes brushing against the silk curtains like a ghost's touch. She sat for a moment before moving, her fingers resting against the edge of the bed, cool with the night's chill. Around her, the other girls stirred in silence. No one spoke. Not out of fear, but because words in the morning always felt like intrusions. The stillness was sacred. Outside her chamber, the gardens awaited. The Hall of Serene Flowers was flanked by paths of carefully swept gravel and manicured trees. Every leaf was arranged with precision, every stone placed by design. Even the natural world here obeyed the rules of the court. Lady Huarong's invitation had not been forgotten. It had been 3 days since that whispered conversation beneath the magnolia tree. Since then, Mei Ling had felt the eyes of others linger longer. The eunuchs bowed slightly deeper. The other concubines, once indifferent, now watched her with narrowed glances and subtle tilts of the head. She was no longer invisible, and that, she was beginning to understand, was not always a blessing. In the morning assembly, the list of names was read again. A droning recitation, one after another. Some smiled with faint relief at being omitted. Others held their breath. Mei Ling's name remained absent. Later, while arranging scrolls in the calligraphy room, a duty she had been assigned to in the absence of imperial summons, she heard footsteps. Light, deliberate. Turning, she saw Lady Huarong once more. This time, the older woman did not smile. "You have been seen," she said, tracing a fingertip along the edge of a lacquered writing desk. "That is a beginning, but visibility, child, is not safety. Do you know what makes a woman truly untouchable in this place?" Mei Ling shook her head. "Loyalty," Lady Huarong replied, her voice a whisper. "Not to the Emperor. He forgets us. We are petals in a storm. No, you must tie yourself to someone who never forgets, someone whose memory is long and whose reach is longer." She didn't wait for a reply. Instead, she handed Mei Ling a folded scrap of silk with a plum blossom embroidered on one corner. A mark, a message, a doorway, perhaps. That night, Mei Ling lit a single candle in her chamber and studied the silk. She did not understand its meaning, only that it felt like a weight pressing down on her hands. The walls of her room felt smaller, the night deeper. The following day, she was summoned, not to the Emperor, but to the inner archives. It was an unusual place for a concubine to be called. The archives were the domain of eunuchs and scribes, not women wrapped in rouge and perfume. Yet she obeyed. Inside, the scent of old paper and ink filled the air. Scrolls stretched across low tables, and figures in grey robes moved like shadows. One of them gestured for her to approach. He was tall, his face unreadable, and his voice softer than parchment. "You are to assist with the inventory, temporarily." Mei Ling nodded and joined the line of scribes, her fingers trembling slightly as she began to copy titles into the ledgers. She didn't know who had arranged this, but she suspected it had something to do with the silk message. And Lady Huarong. For the next week she remained there, quietly working among the eunuchs and clerks. It was a different kind of world, quiet, methodical, yet filled with secrets. She heard names spoken in passing, ministers, commanders, even members of the Emperor's family, documents detailing estates, bribes, appointments. The Empire lived on paper as much as it did on command, and she listened, always. It was during one of these days that she noticed a change in the air. A particular scribe, always seated near the front, no longer appeared. His absence was not remarked upon. When she asked in cautious tones, the other scribes grew silent. Later she found his desk cleared, his scrolls removed. Not a trace of his presence left. That was how disappearances worked here. Not with a scream or a chase, but with quiet efficiency, as though a person had never existed at all. When she returned to the Hall of Serene Flowers that evening, Lady Huarong was waiting near the garden wall. "Do you see now?" she asked, her voice low. "Every piece moved has a cost, even silence." Mei Ling did not reply. Instead, she looked up at the night sky, where the moon hovered pale and distant. She wondered what her mother would think if she could see her daughter now. Not as a bride to the Emperor, but as a girl caught in the slow, silent machinery of power. A pawn being pulled across a board she could barely see. There were no allies here. Only trades. Smiles that meant nothing. Promises spoken through veils. Safety was a negotiation. And Mei Ling, though young, was learning to speak the language. One evening, as the season tipped gently toward autumn, a visitor arrived. Not to the Emperor, but to the Empress Dowager. The palace buzzed with quiet urgency. Servants moved quickly, eunuchs barked sharper orders. Mei Ling, from a corner near the archives, caught only glimpses. A foreign envoy, they whispered, with gifts and demands. Later, in the calligraphy room, a scroll was laid before her with a new seal. The ink was still damp. "Copy this," said the eunuch. "Word for word, no error." As she began her task, she saw it was a message from the Empress Dowager herself, addressed to one of the imperial advisors. The contents were vague, but hinted at shifting allegiances and uncertain alliances. Politics moving beneath the surface like koi beneath a still pond. Mei Ling's hand did not tremble, but her heart did. Lady Huarong appeared again that night, bringing a single plum blossom and placing it by Mei Ling's bed. "Now you are listening," she said. And Mei Ling knew she was no longer just a concubine. She was something else now. A watcher, a listener, a thread in a vast, silent tapestry being woven in the dark. The morning mist hung thick over the palace roofs, turning every tile and tower into a blurred watercolour of grey and gold. Beneath it all, the imperial city stirred, but quietly, like a beast unsure whether to wake or sleep. Within the Hall of Serene Flowers, Mei Ling sat at her vanity, the soft bristles of a makeup brush gliding over her cheek in rhythmic circles. Her reflection stared back at her, calm, composed, unreadable. She had learned this expression well. It had been nearly a month since her silent entry into the inner archives. Since then, a curious balance had been struck. Mei Ling remained unchosen by the Emperor, her name left untouched on the selection scrolls. To many, this meant she was forgotten. But those who watched closely, the quiet-eyed eunuchs, the older consorts Lady Huarong, they knew differently. Favour in the palace did not always come from the Emperor's gaze. The archives gave Mei Ling access to a different world, one that moved beneath the silken surfaces. She copied petitions, memoranda, and letters laced with implication. While her lips stayed sealed, her mind opened like a door left ajar in the wind. She learned which ministers visited the Empress Dowager at night, which general's son had been caught in debt, which concubine had secretly given birth and whose child had vanished the next morning. Names, dates, allegiances. It was not power, not yet, but it was proximity to it. And in the Forbidden City, that alone could change a woman's fate. One afternoon, as the light slanted golden across the papered windows, Mei Ling was summoned, not to a duty or a chamber, but to the Imperial Garden. A rare thing, and usually a dangerous one. The garden was not a place for idle walks. It was a stage where meetings occurred behind fans, where whispers passed through hedges, and where accusations often began with the rustle of a leaf. She arrived at the appointed hour, her steps measured, hands folded neatly in front of her. The air was fragrant with late chrysanthemums and the faint burn of incense wafting from a nearby shrine. Lady Huarong stood beneath a ginkgo tree, her robe a deep crimson, her hair coiled high with gold pins shaped like butterflies. "There are eyes upon you now," she said without turning. "I know," Mei Ling answered quietly. "Then you must choose what they see." Mei Ling hesitated. "What am I to be?" Lady Huarong finally looked at her, a small smile curving her lips, something like approval, but distant, practiced. "Not a flower, a vine. Flowers are admired and forgotten, but vines, they climb." A breeze passed through the garden, lifting the hem of Mei Ling's sleeve. She noticed then that Lady Huarong's fingers were gloved, though the weather was warm. Rumour whispered that she had once been punished with heated tongs for a perceived insult to the Empress Dowager. Her grace was not without scars. Lady Huarong stepped closer. "Tonight, there is a gathering in the Hall of the Moon Gate. Not all are invited. You will go." Mei Ling blinked. "But I—" "You will go," Lady Huarong repeated. "Wear the lilac robe, the one with the cloud pattern, and speak to no one unless spoken to." That night, the Hall of the Moon Gate shimmered with candlelight and the low hum of music played by invisible musicians behind silk screens. The room was smaller than the grand halls used for state ceremonies, but more ornate, as if meant for secrets rather than spectacle. Concubines of higher rank floated through the space like wraiths, all silk and smiles, their voices never rising above a murmur. The scent of jasmine and wine mingled with something sharper beneath. Ambition. Mei Ling moved cautiously, her lilac robe trailing behind her, the cloud pattern catching light like mist on water. She kept her eyes lowered, hands folded. She was an ornament, nothing more. But even ornaments are noticed. A man approached, not the emperor, nor a eunuch, but a minister, tall, with silver at his temples, and the look of someone used to being obeyed. He said nothing at first, only studied her with the gaze of one assessing a piece of lacquerware. "You are Lady Mei Ling?" he asked at last. "I am." "You serve in the archives?" "Yes, my lord." "Then you know the weight of silence." Mei Ling nodded. The man smiled faintly. "And perhaps the weight of knowledge." He said no more and disappeared into the room, leaving her heart pounding with questions. She remained through the evening, saying little, watching much. When she returned to her chamber that night, she found a box resting on her pillow. Inside was a single jade pendant, shaped like a fan, its surface carved with a plum blossom, Lady Huarong's sign. Beneath it, a folded note in elegant script. "You are being remembered." The days that followed were sharper, more brittle. Conversations ceased when she entered rooms. Servants bowed lower. Eunuchs delivered her food with 2 hands now, not 1. And with visibility came danger. One morning, as she made her way toward the archive hall, a girl brushed past her roughly, muttering something beneath her breath. Mei Ling turned in surprise, but the girl had already vanished into the corridor. On her tray, one of the inkstones had been tipped over, staining the scroll she carried. Later, she found her comb snapped in 2, her robes misfolded. Nothing overt, nothing that could be reported, but each moment a warning. Lady Huarong said nothing of it. She only watched. Then came the message. A eunuch arrived in the afternoon, his face impassive. "Lady Mei Ling, you are summoned to the pavilion of Painted Springs." She had never heard the name before. It was not on the usual routes, not a place for concubines. Yet she bowed and followed, her heart a steady drumbeat in her chest. The path wound through unfamiliar parts of the palace, the tiles newer, the guards fewer. The pavilion stood alone, half-shadowed by trees, its entrance marked by 2 lanterns shaped like swans. Inside, incense burned in a small brass dish. A single woman sat waiting. She was neither old nor young. Her face bore the softness of wealth, but her eyes were like frost over a pond. Still, unforgiving. "You have learned much," the woman said, "but you must now decide what you will do with what you know." Mei Ling bowed. "My lady, I am only a servant of the court." "No," the woman said gently. "You are a servant of someone. Choose wisely." Mei Ling left the pavilion with the scent of sandalwood clinging to her sleeves and a quiet thunder in her chest. Her world had grown larger once again, and darker. The game had deepened, and now there was no way back. The rains came early that year. They began not with the roaring storms of summer, but with a hush, a persistent drizzle that fell like breath against the eaves of the Forbidden City. The rooftops gleamed with water, their golden tiles dulled to pewter. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of wet stone and magnolia. Inside the palace walls, the world shrank. Courtyards turned into glistening pools, gardens into mazes of dripping leaves. Servants moved more slowly, their footsteps muffled by dampened slippers and sodden walkways. The palace, so grand in sunlight, now felt like a sealed box where whispers echoed louder than thunder. Mei Ling stood beneath the overhang of her chamber's doorway, watching the rain trace rivulets down the wooden columns. A tray of tea cooled beside her, untouched. The jade pendant lay in her palm, the carved plum blossom catching the faint light like a secret. She had not seen Lady Huarong since her summons to the pavilion of Painted Springs. The woman she met there, elegant, cold, unnamed, had left her with no instructions, only a statement. Choose wisely. But what was the choice? The lines within the palace were not clearly drawn. Allegiances were hidden beneath smiles layered beneath silk. The Empress Dowager ruled through subtlety and suggestion. The Emperor, aloof and distant, saw concubines as adornments, not allies. Ministers moved like pieces on a board only they could see. And in the middle stood women like Mei Ling, elevated by beauty, bound by silence, and drifting in a sea of invisible tides. That morning, as the rain continued, Mei Ling was summoned once again, this time not to the archives or a private pavilion, but to the Hall of Resplendent Harmony, a place of protocol, a place where ranks were acknowledged and decorum enforced like scripture. She dressed with care, choosing a robe of soft grey embroidered with delicate cranes. Understated, respectful. Her hair was swept into a modest bun, held by a single carved pin. No jewellery, no perfume. The hall was vast, cold, and lit by dozens of lanterns that reflected off polished stone floors. Mei Ling was one of several concubines called that day, most older, their titles established. They stood in a neat line along the edges of the room while court officials gathered near the dais. Above them sat the Empress Dowager, her expression unreadable beneath layers of gold-threaded silk and finely applied powder. A procession began. Documents were read, appointments declared, minor changes in rank announced, the sort of ceremony that meant little in the outside world but shaped the future of many within the palace. And then came a name. Lady Mei Ling is hereby advanced to the rank of noble woman. The words landed like a bell rung in a quiet chamber. Mei Ling bowed low, her head nearly touching the floor. She felt eyes upon her, some curious, others resentful, a few calculating. It was not a high rank, not yet, but it was elevation, recognition, favour. Later, in the shadowed corridors behind the hall, a voice brushed her ear like wind through reeds. "You're moving too quickly," it said. She turned, but no one was there. The news spread as quickly as rain down a roof tile. By the time Mei Ling returned to her chamber, 2 silk robes had been delivered. A servant girl she did not know bowed deeply and informed her that her quarters were to be moved closer to the Lotus Pavilion, a sign of rising status. But with each new privilege came new scrutiny. The following day, her tea tasted faintly of almonds. She did not drink it. A slip of paper was left among her linens, written in hurried strokes, "Do not trust the ones who smile too much." That night, as she lay beneath her coverlet, she remembered the minister at the Hall of the Moon Gate and the frost-eyed woman in the Painted Springs Pavilion. She remembered Lady Huarong's words, "Flowers are admired, but vines climb." And she began to understand what it meant to grow within the palace. Growth here was not upward, but outward, like roots creeping beneath stone. There were whispers of other concubines, those who had risen too quickly. One, a former dancer from the southern provinces, had caught the emperor's eye and borne him a son. Within months, the child was ill. The woman was sent to a quiet monastery outside the city. The child did not recover. Another, older and shrewd, had managed to curry favour with 3 influential ministers. She vanished one spring morning. Her chamber was reassigned that same afternoon. Names disappeared, faces changed, and no one ever spoke of them again. So Mei Ling became cautious. She accepted gifts with polite detachment. She declined invitations with delicate excuses. She learned which servants could be trusted and which merely waited to report. She began to rise early and walk in the gardens alone, memorising who passed her, who followed, who lingered. And still, the rain fell. One evening, during a lull in the downpour, a eunuch approached her with an unfamiliar seal in his hand. It was an invitation, not to a ceremony, nor a duty, but to tea, in the garden of whispering bamboo. The name meant little to most, but Mei Ling had heard it before, in the archives, hidden in the footnotes of a memorial drafted by a dismissed official. It was a place of quiet discussion, a place where alliances were formed in low voices over warm porcelain cups. She went alone. The garden was dim, lit only by lanterns swaying the breeze. The bamboo rustled like paper, their leaves brushing against the high walls in soft patterns. At the centre sat a small table, already prepared with 2 cups and a steaming pot. Opposite her sat the minister from the Moongate evening. He gestured for her to sit. She did so cautiously, every movement calculated. "You have a talent," he said, pouring the tea. "Not of beauty. There are many beautiful women here, but you see things, you listen." Mei Ling said nothing. He slid a folded scroll across the table. "This is a name," he said. "Read it carefully, then forget it." She took the scroll, unfolded it. A single name, a powerful one. "This man is not your enemy," the minister said, sipping his tea, "but one day he might become someone else's." Mei Ling looked at the scroll again. The characters burned into her memory like fire through silk. "And what do I do with this?" she asked. The minister smiled. "Whatever you choose. That's why you've been noticed." The wind shifted and the bamboo danced in the fading light. 1,000 leaves rustled above them, murmuring secrets in a tongue only the palace seemed to know. Mei Ling tucked the scroll into her sleeve, and as she rose to leave, she knew one thing with certainty. She was no longer waiting to be chosen. She was choosing. The palace looked different at night. Its courtyards, normally bustling with silk-clad servants and the clatter of ceremonial life, became vast, echoing spaces of shadow and silence. Lanterns flickered in the corridors like fireflies trapped behind silk, and the faint scent of sandalwood drifted through the halls, curling between the columns like a wandering spirit. Mei Ling sat by the small writing desk in her newly assigned quarters near the Lotus Pavilion. A more prestigious location, they told her, closer to the Emperor's wing. But Mei Ling knew better. Proximity was not favour, it was visibility, and visibility was risk. The scroll she had been given in the bamboo garden lay unrolled before her. The name etched in careful ink stared back at her, a high official, one she had seen only once in passing, surrounded by guards and whispers. She knew little about him, only that he seldom spoke in court, and when he did, his words weighed heavier than others. The minister who had given it to her had said little. The message, Mei Ling sensed, was not just about information. It was about trust, about leverage, about testing the boundaries of her role in the palace's silent war. She had not yet acted on it. She would not until she understood the board more fully. Outside, the rain had lessened into a gentle mist. The garden lanterns shimmered through the haze, casting patterns across her chamber wall. A knock at her door broke the silence, soft, deliberate. It was a servant girl, no older than 12, with eyes too alert for her age. She bowed and handed Mei Ling a small lacquered box, then vanished without a word. Inside the box was a hairpin, delicate, of silver and jade, shaped like a peony in bloom. A note lay beneath it, written on rice paper so thin it felt like breath. From one flower to another, bloom carefully. No signature, no seal. But Mei Ling recognised the star, Lady Huarong. She turned the pin over in her hand. It was not just a gift, it was a message, a reminder. She was being watched still and expected to grow, but not too fast. By now, Mei Ling understood the code of the palace. Every gesture was layered. A glance could be a threat, a compliment could be poison, and kindness, especially from another concubine, always had a cost. The next morning, the rain stopped at last. The palace dried like a paper scroll laid in the sun, its stones warming, its trees shedding droplets that sparkled like tears. With the clear skies came renewed activity. Preparations for the Mid-Autumn Festival, one of the grandest events of the imperial calendar. Silk lanterns were hung across walkways, their colours vivid against the pale walls. Musicians practised in the courtyards, their zithers and flutes echoing in the crisp air. Artisans wove gold threads into new robes for the favoured few, and kitchen servants rolled mooncakes with elaborate fillings, the scent of lotus paste drifting through the chambers. The concubines, too, began to stir. For many, the festival was an opportunity to be seen, to be remembered, to present themselves before the emperor. Mei Ling, newly promoted and newly watched, knew she would be expected to attend. When her invitation arrived, a parchment square bound with red cord, she unfolded it slowly, expecting to find a place among the minor consorts. Instead, her name was listed for the Imperial Terrace, a place reserved for the most prominent. That evening, she visited Lady Huarong without requesting permission. The senior consort was seated by her window, weaving a length of silk thread through an embroidery hoop. She did not look up when Mei Ling entered. "You've been given the terrace," Huarong said, as though commenting on the weather. "Do you know why?" Mei Ling bowed. "Because someone wants me to be seen," Lady Huarong smiled faintly. "No, because someone wants to see who reacts to your presence there." She set down the embroidery and rose, stepping closer, her voice lowered. "The terrace is not a reward, it is a mirror. Stand upon it, and the court will show its face." Mei Ling absorbed the words in silence. When she left, the sun had nearly set, and the lotus pond shimmered gold in the dying light. The night of the festival arrived with the scent of incense and the rustle of 1,000 silks. The palace blazed with lanterns shaped like dragons, phoenixes and lotuses. Every step of every pathway was swept clean, every branch trimmed to perfection. Music floated through the halls, and laughter, careful, practiced laughter, rose into the air like petals on wind. Mei Ling dressed in a robe of pale green, its embroidery so fine the cranes upon the hem seemed to lift when she walked. Her hair was coiled into a high crown, the peony hairpin gleaming among its folds. When she stepped onto the terrace, the night opened before her. The entire court stretched out like a scroll beneath the moonlight. The emperor was there, seated upon a raised dais, his face half-shadowed. Around him stood the most powerful, generals, ministers, consorts, and the Empress Dowager herself, wrapped in layers of gold like a lion in repose. Mei Ling took her place among the other women, her expression serene, her eyes lowered. And then she began to watch. It was subtle, but she felt it. The moment her presence registered. A ripple, small but certain. A flicker in the Empress Dowager's gaze. A whispered exchange between two ministers. A faint tightening in the jaw of a high-ranking concubine. Lady Huarong, seated a level above, glanced at her only once. A brief acknowledgement. Then, as if nothing had occurred, she turned back toward the moon. Mei Ling stood quietly, her hands folded. She smiled once at no one in particular. And all the while she listened. She heard a phrase murmured in passing, "the merchant's daughter." She caught a glance filled not with jealousy but with calculation. And she saw one woman step forward to offer the emperor a cup of tea, only to pause, just briefly, when her sleeve brushed Mei Ling's. Tiny moments, unspoken meanings. But in the court, those were the loudest kind. The moon climbed higher, round and cold above the crimson roofs. Lanterns danced in the breeze, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to whisper, shift and vanish. And Mei Ling, standing beneath the glow of 100 flickering lights, knew without doubt she had stepped into the centre of the circle. Not a pawn now, but a piece being moved by many hands. The game was underway. In the days that followed the Mid-Autumn Festival, the palace returned to its careful rhythm. The lanterns were taken down, the mooncakes stored or discarded, and the musicians sent back to their quiet corners. Yet within the walls of the Forbidden City something had shifted, not visibly, not in words, but like a silk thread subtly tugged out of place in an otherwise perfect weave. Mei Ling awoke earlier now. She dressed before the bell and walked the stone paths of the inner gardens while the dew still clung to the leaves. Her shadow followed her softly, elongated by the pale morning sun. The court might still be asleep, but the palace, the true palace, never rested. She'd no new summons since the festival, no cryptic messages, no visits from Lady Huarong. The stillness should have comforted her, but instead it tightened around her like a silken cord. Then came the rumours. Whispers floated through the air like ash on the wind. A minister had fallen ill. A favoured concubine, Lady Anlai, had collapsed during a tea ceremony and been taken away for treatment, or so the officials claimed. No one had seen her since. Another concubine, younger, ambitious and recently elevated, was discovered in the corridor of the emperor's private study, uninvited. She was not punished, only reassigned to a lesser pavilion. Yet everyone understood the message. One misstep, and the silk unravelled. Mei Ling listened. She kept to her duties in the archives, now attended by only a few eunuchs who barely spoke unless spoken to. There she noticed the absence of a familiar face, an older scribe, gentle-eyed, who had once corrected her brushstroke during a quiet afternoon. He was gone now, his scrolls reassigned, his presence erased like a name scratched from stone. At night, Mei Ling lay awake longer, the hush of the palace seeping into her bones. Her chambers were elegant but cold. Every silk sheet, every embroidered cushion reminded her she was both honoured and held. Then one evening, a shadow appeared at her door. Not a eunuch, not a servant girl. A woman, veiled and hooded, her robe dark and unadorned. "You must come," the woman said simply, and Mei Ling, recognising neither her face nor her voice, obeyed. They moved swiftly through lesser-known halls, narrow passageways that curved behind kitchens and shrines, past storerooms filled with unused ceremonial drums and censers. The smell of cedar and old incense lingered in the air. At last, they reached a door carved with plum blossoms, barely visible in the dim light. Inside, candles flickered low, their flames casting elongated shadows. Lady Huarong stood at the far end, her figure outlined against the paper screen. She dismissed the veiled woman with a nod and gestured for Mei Ling to sit. "The Emperor has been watching," she said, her tone unreadable. "Not with his eyes, but with his ears." Mei Ling remained silent. "You have impressed some," Huarong continued, "and threatened others." She stepped forward, offering a small porcelain cup filled with a steaming, clear broth. Mei Ling accepted it with both hands, but did not drink. "Lady Anli," Mei Ling said softly, "what happened to her?" Lady Huarong's expression did not change. She forgot to be cautious. She believed the Emperor's favour was armour, but here nothing shields you. She turned and walked slowly to the window, parting the screen to let in a faint breeze. Outside, the gardens slept in moonlight. "There are women," Huarong said, "who rise quickly, like fireworks, and then there are those who grow like moss, slow, unseen, until one day they cover the stone." She faced Mei Ling again, her eyes sharp beneath the paint. "Which will you be?" Mei Ling did not answer at once. She looked down into her cup, watching the broth tremble slightly in her hands. Finally she spoke. "I do not wish to burn." A faint smile touched Huarong's lips. "Good, then listen closely." For the next hour, the senior consort outlined names, relationships, histories, not gossip, but structure. Who truly influenced the Emperor's decisions? Which eunuchs owed their posts to which ministers? Which concubines maintained influence not through beauty but through networks of quiet loyalty? And she gave Mei Ling something more dangerous than all of it. A list, a folded sheet of silk paper, no names, only symbols. A peach blossom, a carp, a lion, a crane. Each, Huarong said, represented a faction, a current. One could not remain unaffiliated forever. "You must align," she said, "or be swept aside." When Mei Ling returned to her chamber, the wind had picked up. Her candles flickered low, and outside a storm began to gather, not of rain, but of shifting loyalty. In the days that followed, she began to notice the symbols, embroidered discreetly into cuffs and fans, carved into jade pendants, etched faintly on lacquered boxes. A secret language in plain view, one she had never been taught, until now. She did not act immediately, she observed. A handmaiden with a crane motif in her hairpin delivered news before it was formally known. A eunuch with a lion tattoo beneath his sleeve always lingered in certain corridors. A minor consort favoured the peach blossom, and her robes, always fine, were never questioned by the Empress Doaga's attendants. The court was not just a stage, it was a net, and Mei Ling was learning to weave. One morning, while arranging incense for a ceremony in the Hall of Tranquil Justice, a message slipped into her sleeve. The ink was fresh, the handwriting unfamiliar. "A storm is coming. Find shelter." No signature, no seal, only urgency. She burned the note before the hour ended. That night, from her window, she saw 3 men ride into the palace under cover of dusk. Their robes were heavy with dust from the provinces, their horses foam-flecked. She recognised one, the official whose name had been given to her in the Garden of Whispering Bamboo. The same night, a commotion near the Western Kitchens. An officer of the guard found dead. Heart failure, they said, but no one believed it. Mei Ling sat in silence long after her candles had gone out, the darkness around her deep and unmoving. She no longer dreamed of silks or hairpins, she dreamed of chessboards, of steps echoing in empty halls, of a single crane taking flight over still water. She knew she would have to choose soon, not just a symbol, not just a path, but what kind of woman she would be in a world where beauty was currency, knowledge was danger, and silence could be both shield and sword. Autumn deepened, and with it came a new kind of quiet. The rustle of leaves gave way to stillness. Trees in the outer courtyard stood bare, their branches like fingers stretched skyward in a plea that would never be answered. The stone paths of the Forbidden City, once warmed by summer sun, now held the chill of dawn long after the morning bell. The servants walked faster now, heads bowed lower. Everyone seemed to know, without saying a word, that something was approaching. Within the palace, change did not announce itself with trumpets or banners. It whispered, it crept, and in the silence between footsteps, in the flick of an eye or the pause of a brushstroke, it made itself known. Mei Ling had learned to read the silence. Her routine remained unchanged on the surface. She attended her duties in the archives with quiet precision. She accepted her meals without complaint, wore what was chosen for her, and offered respectful bows to those of higher rank. But beneath her calm exterior, she moved deliberately, gathering, listening, waiting. The symbols Lady Huarong had shared were everywhere now. As if once her eyes had been opened to them, they refused to hide. The peach blossom, the crane, the lion, the carp, all part of the invisible architecture of court life. They marked not just but hierarchies, influence, ambition. Mei Ling had not yet chosen a side, and that too had become its own kind of message. One morning, as the frost clung to the stone balustrades and the breath of the palace workers clouded the air, Mei Ling received a formal summons. This time, it bore not the simple cord or wax seal of the inner court, but the elaborate red and gold script of the Imperial study. The Emperor's domain. She prepared in silence. Her robe was white with silver thread, unassuming yet elegant. Her hair was combed back, held by 2 pearl pins. No perfume, no ornaments. As she walked through the corridor leading to the outer gates of the inner court, she felt the weight of every eye upon her, the curious, the envious, the calculating, but none dared stop her. The Imperial study was not what she had expected. It was smaller than the throne room, darker than the great halls, and filled with the scent of aged paper and sandalwood. Scrolls lined the walls, and the sound of ink brushes scratching against silk echoed faintly from adjacent rooms. She was led into a side chamber. A single table, 2 chairs, a brazier glowed softly in the corner, and on the table sat a pot of tea, untouched. The man who entered was not dressed in yellow, nor did he wear the dragon emblem. He was older than she expected, his face lined not with age, but with the burden of observance. He carried no sword, bore no title openly, but Mei Ling knew at once. This was one of the Emperor's inner circle. "You are Mei Ling," he said, seating himself. She bowed. "Yes, my lord." He poured the tea but did not drink. "You were present at the Garden of Whispering Bamboo." A statement, not a question. "Yes." "You received a name?" "I did." "What did you do with it?" Mei Ling looked down at the tea. Steam rose in thin ghostly threads. "I remembered it." The man nodded, neither pleased nor surprised. "There are 2 kinds of women in this court," he said. "Those who are used and those who use others. Which will you be?" Mei Ling did not reply. He waited, then continued. "The Emperor is not unaware. He sees what needs to be seen and trusts others to see what he cannot. You have been seen." Another pause. The tea cooled between them. "You will be tested," the man said at last. "Not by me, not by any single person, but by the court itself. The palace is alive, Lady Mei Ling. It swallows the weak, it punishes the eager, and it remembers." He rose, signalling the end of the audience. As Mei Ling stood, he added one final word. "Endure." When she returned to her quarters, dusk had already begun to descend. The sky outside was the colour of burnt silk, and the lanterns along the walkways were being lit, one by one. On her table lay a folded piece of parchment, unsigned. "The carp swims beneath still water. It does not need to be seen to grow." She read it twice before committing it to the brazier's flame. The following day, a new assignment arrived. Not to the archives, but to the Hall of Eternal Ceremony, a place used not for governance, but for preservation. There, the records of past reigns were stored, along with the edicts, correspondences, and personal writings of emperors long dead. It was not a task given lightly. Only those trusted with discretion and restraint were permitted to handle such relics. Inside the hall, the air smelled of dust and silence. She was left alone among the scrolls, her only company the slow ticking of time and the faint creak of ancient wood. She worked carefully, opening each bundle, copying titles, noting seals. Hours passed without interruption until, near the bottom of one box, she found a scroll tied with an unfamiliar cord. It was thicker than the others, older, but it bore the official mark of a former empress, one who had ruled nearly 3 generations before. Curious, Mei Ling untied it. Inside were verses, handwritten and deeply personal. Not edicts, but laments. A poem perhaps, or a confession. Lines that spoke of sorrow, betrayal, longing. The last words were faint, as though the hand that wrote them had trembled. "I was loved, then forgotten. My name will be spoken only by the dust." She stared at the characters, chilled. The scroll, though historical, had not been catalogued. It had not been meant to be found. And yet here it was, a memory that had escaped erasure. She rolled it up again, her fingers lingering over the silk. There was no place for sentiment in the palace. But in that quiet moment, Mei Ling understood something more profound than alliances or symbols. That history was not written only by victors, but also hidden by survivors. She would survive, not by being the brightest, not by being the boldest, but by being remembered, quietly, carefully, and only when it mattered most. The nights were growing longer. The air in the Forbidden City took on a bite that curled into sleeves and beneath collars. Braziers now lined the corridors at regular intervals, their soft flames flickering against the polished tiles, casting golden shadow in equal measure. Winter was not yet upon the capital, but its breath was near enough to be felt. Mei Ling had begun to dream again. But her dreams were not soft or sweet. They came like broken reflections of corridors too long, voices without faces, and scrolls that unravelled endlessly. In some, she stood in front of a faceless emperor. In others, she was back in her childhood home, her mother weaving a red sash by candlelight, mouthing words could no longer remember. And always, in the distance, the sound of silk tearing. She did not speak of these dreams. Dreams in the palace were like secrets. Everyone had them, and no one told them truthfully. Her days at the Hall of Eternal Ceremony continued, each task more meticulous than the last. She handled scrolls as though they were the bones of ancient spirits, careful not to disturb what had long been kept still. Each document had its own presence, its own weight. Decrees of execution written in flowing calligraphy, letters from wives to husbands never read aloud, edicts sealed but never enacted. And then there were the marginalia, the tiny notes scrawled in corners, barely legible, often written by the hands of servants or eunuchs, invisible in life, yet eternal in ink. They were the softest voices in history, and Mei Ling listened to them with the reverence of a daughter at her grandmother's knee. One such note she found nestled between pages of an imperial ledger. "If no one will remember me, let the paper do it instead." She sat for a long while after reading that, unmoving. Later that afternoon, as the sun stretched weakly across the rooftops, Mei Ling was approached in the corridor by a eunuch she had never seen before. His robes bore the crane emblem, one of the court's oldest and most conservative factions. His face was narrow, unreadable. "You are requested at the Pavilion of Autumn Sighs," he said. "This evening." She bowed. "By whom?" He did not answer. Instead, he turned and vanished down the hall as though he had never been there. That evening, Mei Ling walked to the pavilion alone, wrapped in a cloak of pale wool. The wind stirred dry leaves across the path, and the lanterns hanging from the trees swayed like pendulums, marking time she could not see. The Pavilion of Autumn Sighs was a lesser-known retreat, not often used in court ceremonies. It stood near the edge of the inner palace, flanked by a narrow stream and willows that wept even without rain. Its beauty was understated, melancholy. Inside, the brazier had already been lit. A single figure stood at the window, watching the willow branches stir in the breeze. It was not Lady Huarong. The woman who turned to greet Mei Ling was older, her robe embroidered with patterns Mei Ling had only ever seen on the Empress Dowager's attendants. Her hair was laced with thin strands of gold, and her gaze was neither harsh nor kind. It was simply clear. "You are the one who found the Empress's scroll," she said. Mei Ling remained still. She had told no one. The woman gestured toward a small table set for tea. "Sit. Speak plainly. I do not tolerate ceremony." So Mei Ling sat. She chose her words carefully. "I found it while cataloguing the documents of the Third Dynasty. It was among the personal records of Empress Xu." The woman nodded. "You read it." "I did." "Did you understand it?" "I believe so." The woman poured tea for them both, the steam rising between them like mist. "You are young," she said, "but you are not foolish. That is rare. Rarer still is the woman who can be both silent and significant." She took a sip before continuing. "Empress Xu was not remembered fondly in the court's official record. She bore no heirs. She fell from favour. Her name was removed from certain scrolls, but she was not weak. She understood too much." Mei Ling kept her eyes on the tea. "She knew she would be forgotten." "She feared it," the woman replied. "Which is why she left behind a voice, not loud but lasting. You found it. That is no accident." Mei Ling raised her gaze then. "Was it meant to be found?" "Perhaps not by you. but it was meant to survive. The woman leaned back slightly, the weight of her gaze settling upon Myling like frost. There is a faction forming, quiet but deliberate, a group that believes in preserving memory, even when it is inconvenient. We collect voices, truths, things the court would prefer to forget. And what do you do with them? Myling asked softly. We wait. A pause passed between them. Would you join us? The woman asked. Myling looked down at the cup between her fingers. The tea had cooled. I will listen, she said. The woman smiled faintly. That is how it begins. Before Myling left, the woman handed her a folded slip of parchment. When the time is right, she said, you'll know what to do with this. She did not open it until she returned to her chamber. Inside, no words, only a single inked symbol, the outline of a closed fan, shaded lightly with plum blossoms. It was not a faction she had seen before, and yet it felt familiar, like something she had always known but never noticed. That night she placed the slip beneath her pillow, then extinguished her lamp. The silence of the Forbidden City pressed in from all sides. But within it, Myling felt something new. Not fear. Not readiness. The first frost came without warning. One morning, the leaves that clung stubbornly to the trees had turned brittle and pale. The stone steps shimmered with a fine white dust, and the lotus ponds froze at their edges, capturing fallen petals in delicate cages of ice. Servants wrapped their hands in cloth as they worked, their breath rising in soft clouds before them. The Forbidden City wore winter like an old memory, one that returned each year not with celebration, but with silence. Myling adjusted to the season quietly. She added another layer beneath her robes, sipped hot water instead of tea, and kept her fingers moving even in idleness to keep the numbness at bay. But inwardly, she remained still, watchful. The parchment bearing the symbol of the closed fan remained under her pillow, untouched since the night she received it. She did not show it to anyone, not even Lady Huarong. There were things now that Myling understood must be kept even from those who had once opened doors for her. The court was entering a period of transition. She could feel it in the rhythm of the palace, slower, heavier, as if the weight of the coming snow bore down on more than just rooftops. Whispers multiplied. One of the emperor's ministers was said to have fallen ill, though others claimed he had been quietly removed. A noble woman in the Empress Dowager's circle ceased appearing at ceremonies, her name struck from lists with no explanation. Myling heard these things without reacting. She continued her work in the Hall of Eternal Ceremony, though fewer scrolls now arrived. The eunuchs who passed through the hall did so with greater urgency, and more than once she caught a glimpse of unfamiliar robes marked with the dragon's eye, a symbol of the emperor's personal authority. And then, one evening, as the sun dipped low behind the walls and the frost deepened to ice, she was summoned again. This time not to a pavilion or a study, but to a private courtyard tucked behind the southern wall. An area rarely used, its entrance half concealed by overgrown hedges and disused stone paths. She arrived without escort. A single lantern hung by the gate, its flame low. Inside she found Lady Huarong waiting beside a brazier. Her expression was colder than the air. "You've been quiet," Huarong said. Myling bowed. "As you once taught me." Too quiet. A pause. The wind stirred the coals, casting a brief glow across Huarong's face. "There are rumours," she said, "that you have aligned yourself elsewhere." Myling did not speak. She kept her gaze steady. "I opened doors for you," Huarong continued, her voice still calm but laced with tension. "I offered protection, instruction. I do not take betrayal lightly." Myling remained still. "I have not betrayed you." "Then where do your loyalties lie?" Mayling's reply came gently. "With memory." Lady Huarong's gaze darkened. "That is not an answer. That is a veil." Another gust of wind passed through the courtyard, rattling the lantern's glass. At length, Lady Huarong turned away, her voice softer now. "You are not the first girl I've guided, but you may be the first who believes she can walk both paths." Silence stretched between them. "I have no intention of challenging you," Myling said, "but I will not be bound." Huarong turned back toward her. In her eyes, not anger, not betrayal, but disappointment. And perhaps, beneath it, something fainter. Respect. "You are braver than I thought," she said, "and more dangerous." She stepped aside, allowing Myling to leave without another word. Back in her chamber, Myling found a small scroll tucked into the folds of her bedding. It had not been there when she left. Its seal was unfamiliar, a plum blossom encircled not by ink but by fine threads of silver dust. She opened it slowly. Within, a single phrase. When memory stirs, shadows shift. Be still and let them pass. No signature, no instructions, only quiet counsel. The following days passed in half-light. Snow began to fall in earnest, soft and slow, blanketing the tiled roofs and muffling every sound. The palace moved like a dream, footsteps barely audible, voices hushed, the world outside its gates all but forgotten. It was during one of these snowbound days that Mei Ling was summoned to the Tower of the Eastern Watch, a part of the palace typically reserved for guards and stewards. She climbed the narrow stairs alone. At the top, in a room that overlooked the outer walls, she found a man seated by the window, the same man she had met once before in the Imperial study. He gestured for her to sit. "They speak of you now," he said, without preamble, "in the minister's chambers, among the concubines, even in the kitchens." Mei Ling said nothing. "You are becoming a symbol, not of beauty, not of favour, but of persistence." He poured tea from a plain clay pot, the steam rising like fog over a battlefield. "Do you know what symbols do, Lady Mei Ling?" he asked. She shook her head. "They unsettle." A pause. "The Emperor has begun to take note, not of you specifically, but of the shifts you leave in your wake. He is not pleased, nor is he angered, but he is curious, and curiosity is not always safe." Mei Ling met his gaze. "I do not seek danger." "No," he said, "but you've learned how to carry it." He set the teacup down. "There will be a choice soon, not of factions, not of symbols, of legacy. The court may change, the emperor may fade, but what is remembered, what is written, that will remain." Mei Ling felt the words settle over her like snow. "What must I do?" she asked. The man smiled faintly. "Nothing, not yet." He handed her a small object wrapped in cloth. "But when the time comes, use this." She unwrapped it later, in private. It was a seal, simple, carved from dark jade, bearing no name, only the faint outline of a closed fan, just like the symbol beneath her pillow. Not a weapon, a key. The snow fell for 3 days without pause. It softened every sound, turned roofs into white ridges, and buried footprints before they could be remembered. Even the crows, bold and shrill in autumn, now huddled in silence beneath the eaves. Winter, when it finally arrived, did so with a quiet certainty. Not cruel, but resolute. Within the palace walls, the hush of the season seemed to deepen the sense of watchfulness. Conversations were shorter, movements slower. The crackling of firewood became a kind of music, and the aroma of ginger broth was enough to draw attention in the corridors. Everyone moved as if sleepwalking through the snow-laced stillness, yet all were listening, waiting. Mei Ling moved with care. The seal she had received, dark jade, cold in her hand, now rested within a hidden compartment beneath her desk. She had turned it over many times, studying the weight, the smoothness, the faint grooves of the closed fan etched upon it. It bore no name, but she knew what it meant. It was not a mark of rank. It was not a favour from the Emperor. It was something older, quieter, a sign of belonging. Since that day in the tower, she had not seen the man again, nor had she heard from Lady Huarong, but her days were not empty. In the Hall of Eternal Ceremony, she noticed subtle changes. Scrolls from certain dynasties were suddenly off-limits. An entire shelf of records had been relocated. A scribe she had worked beside for months now avoided her eyes and spoke only when necessary. And then there were the absences. 2 concubines, not prominent but respected, failed to appear at the monthly offering ceremony. No one spoke of them. Their chambers were not reassigned. Their names were not erased, but neither were they mentioned. This was how disappearances worked in the palace, not with drama, but with omission. One evening, as snow hissed against the paper screens of her window, Mei Ling returned from her duties to find a package wrapped in pale linen resting on her table. It was tied with red string, not the ceremonial crimson used in festivals, but a deeper hue, like dried plum wine. Inside were pages, worn, brittle, and filled with ink so faded it could barely be read. They were not poems, nor edicts. They were transcriptions, testimonies, it seemed, copied in an elegant but ancient hand, names unfamiliar, voices long gone. She was taken in the night. The nursemaid saw nothing. They buried her beneath the osmanthus grove. The tree still blooms, but the roots are fed by silence. Do not trust the women who smile before they speak. Mei Ling read each line as if breathing it, as though the words might evaporate were she too hasty. At the bottom of one page was a mark, the same fan symbol, smaller this time, barely visible. These were not official histories, they were private recollections, saved by someone who had risked much to remember. Someone like her. And though no instructions came with them, the message was clear. She was no longer just gathering. She was now part of the memory itself. For days afterwards, she walked differently through the palace, slower, more attentive. Every screen might hide a watcher, every bowl of tea might contain a warning. But also, each folded robe might carry a message. Each lantern's flicker might be a signal. She had entered a world layered upon the visible one, a shadow court whose corridors were made not of stone, but of silence and remembrance. It was during one of these walks, a routine visit to the storage annex near the western wall, that she encountered a girl she did not recognize. Young, slight, dressed in plain linen, she appeared to be organizing boxes, her back to Mei Ling. But when Mei Ling stepped closer, the girl whispered without turning. "You carry a seal," she said. "You should know there's a letter beneath the altar stone." Then she stood, bowed, and vanished through a side door before Mei Ling could respond. That night, Mei Ling waited until the moon rose high and the halls were quiet. She wrapped herself in a thick robe and made her way to the old shrine near the southern pavilion, a place few visited, maintained only for tradition's sake. It was there, behind the wooden altar, beneath a stone loose in its setting, that she found a scroll wrapped in black thread. She took it back to her quarters and unrolled it slowly, careful not to tear the delicate parchment. What is lost can still be written. What is written can still be remembered. When the emperor falls ill, do not fear the silence. It is how the truth begins to speak. There were no names, only those 3 lines, followed by a symbol she had not seen before, a dragon drawn without its claws. Not the imperial emblem, something older, or perhaps something broken. The next morning, the first official news came. The emperor was unwell. The announcement was brief. A mild condition, the court physician said, nothing of concern. But those who had lived long within the palace knew better. The emperor's meals had changed. His processions ceased. No music sounded from the Hall of Celestial Radiance, where he had once held private audiences. And most telling, the Empress Dowager had begun appearing more frequently in court. The emperor, once distant, had become absent. Mei Ling sat in the Hall of Eternal Ceremony that afternoon, a blank scroll before her, a brush in her hand. But she did not write. She listened to the stillness, deeper now, thicker, like snow upon snow. Change had begun, but unlike in the outer world where the seasons moved with wind and sun, change in the Forbidden City came with silence, sealed scrolls and footsteps that never echoed. Mei Ling set down her brush. She reached for her hidden compartment, and she pressed the seal, her seal, into the wax of an empty document, not to send it, not yet, but to see it, to feel what it meant to leave a mark. A fan, closed, waiting. The wind changed. It was not a sudden gust or a violent swirl, but a shift in breath, the way the air in the courtyards now paused, as if waiting. The servants sensed it first. Their steps grew lighter, their glances more frequent. They walked the corridors with lowered heads, holding trays tighter, folding robes with an urgency that had nothing to do with the season. Something was ending. And within that ending, something else, quieter, older, had begun to stir. The emperor's illness had not improved. That much was clear, even as officials insisted on his recovery. No processions, no decrees, no appearances at the central shrine during solstice preparations. Rumours spread like oil through cloth, slow but inescapable. A shadow passed over the court, not loud, not declared, but thick enough to dim the lantern light. Mei Ling moved through this silence like someone long practiced. Her role had become one of restraint. She spoke less, bowed more, but behind her calm demeanour, her eyes missed little. The scrolls had begun to change. In the Hall of Eternal Ceremony, documents arrived with red seals she had never seen before, urgent, unraidable, without special clearance. Some bore the symbol of the dragon without claws, the same mark that had adorned the parchment hidden beneath the altar. Others were burned before she could even touch them, delivered in heat-proof trays and handled only by eunuchs dressed in black. The past was being rewritten in real time. One evening, returning from her duties, she found her chamber colder than usual. The brazier had not been lit. No tea waited. But there was a new object on her table. A single wooden comb, plain, slightly curved, wrapped in rice paper. She unfolded the paper. There was no message, only a small ink stamp in the corner. A fan, this time half open. It was the first change to the symbol she had carried for weeks. Subtle, intentional, a signal. That night, Mei Ling did not sleep. Instead, she sat beside the window, watching the falling snow. She held the comb in her hand, tracing its smooth ridges. It was an ordinary item, but its placement, its delivery, made it something else entirely. She thought of the scrolls she had seen, the testimonies passed into her hands like prayer beads. Names erased, memories hidden, the voices that history had refused to carry. And she began to understand. Her presence in the palace was no longer an accident. It had not been for some time. She was not just a girl who had learned to listen. She was becoming a keeper. 3 days later, the first funeral rites were quietly announced. Not for the emperor. Not yet. For Minister Zhao. A man of significant influence. One whose voice had long echoed through the great halls. He had fallen ill, they said. A chill that turned to fever. A misstep on icy stairs. No one could agree. His death was confirmed by officials who did not mourn. Lady Huarong reappeared that evening. She came to Mei Ling's chamber unannounced, veiled against the snow, her face paler than Mei Ling remembered. She did not remove her gloves. "We do not speak of the emperor," she said. "Not anymore." Mei Ling nodded. "Do you understand what that means?" "I do." Huarong studied her for a long moment. "I warned you once that you would have to choose." "I have. And my loyalty is not to the man, it is to the memory." Huarong's expression did not change, but her voice softened, almost imperceptibly. "Then you must protect it." She handed Mei Ling a folded cloth, old, worn, spotted with faint marks of ink. Inside was a list of names, some crossed out, others circled. It was written in 2 hands. Mei Ling recognized neither. "Who wrote this?" "Women," Huarong replied. "Before you. What happened to them?" "Some were forgotten, others became memory themselves." The next morning, Mei Ling was reassigned. Her official title remained, but her duties were moved to the Imperial Repository, a more secure archive, deeper within the palace, where the oldest scrolls and most sensitive records were held. She was told it was an honor, a reward for her precision. She understood it for what it was, a test. The repository was unlike any other hall. It had no windows, no music. Guards stood at its doors day and night. The air inside was dry, cold, smelling of cedarwood and old secrets. She was assigned a corner table, given gloves, and ordered to wear a face veil while handling certain texts. Most were genealogies, family lines of the royal house, births and deaths recorded in graceful calligraphy. But hidden within them were inconsistencies. Children listed with no mothers, names duplicated across generations, a wife's name erased, and then restored in a different hand. Mei Ling began to keep a second ledger, hidden beneath the folds of her cloak. In it she noted these fragments, the gaps, the lies. She did not know yet what shape they would take, but she knew the ledger mattered. Each evening she returned to her quarters with aching hands and a mind full of ghosts. She boiled water, watched steam curl against the glass, and pressed her fingers to the edge of the hidden seal beneath her desk. She no longer dreamed. She remembered. One night, as snow gathered thick upon the walkways, a servant girl passed her a folded scrap of silk beneath a tray of steamed dumplings. Mei Ling waited until the chamber was empty before she opened it. Inside, a single sentence. "If the emperor dies, so do the records." It was not a warning, it was a truth. The next day, guards appeared in the repository, silent, still. They did not interfere, but their presence throbbed like a bruise. Mei Ling worked slowly, aware that every scroll she touched might be the last of its kind. That evening, she opened her ledger and added a new line beneath the list of inconsistencies. Preserve before permission is asked, record before silence is enforced. She underlined it once, and then, by candlelight, she began to copy what must not be forgotten. The days shortened into a kind of stillness that blanketed the palace more deeply than snow ever could. It was not the silence of peace, but the quiet of something withheld, as if all within the forbidden city had drawn in a breath and refused to let it go. Footsteps were softer, doors opened slower. Even the wind seemed to hesitate before pushing against the shutters. And somewhere behind the carved walls and frozen courtyards, The Emperor remained unseen. Mei Ling's world had narrowed to a single corridor. Each morning she was escorted, without words, from her quarters to the Imperial repository. 2 guards flanked the doors. Neither spoke to her. She passed through the great arch of lacquered wood and stepped into a world colder than the air outside. Scrolls lined the walls, tall enough to cast shadows that reached the floor. The scent of dried ink, sandalwood oil, and aging parchment filled her lungs. Here, memory was not just stored, it was defended. She worked in near isolation, gloves on, veil down, her movements quiet, deliberate. She transcribed records under the faint light of lanterns whose wax never seemed to burn down. Most days, no one entered, but she felt the presence of others, not seen, not named, just glimpsed from the corner of her vision, a hem of silk vanishing around a shelf, a whisper of motion behind a screen. The records she handled grew stranger. Some were incomplete, scrolls missing their seals, dates smudged, names scratched out. Others had been rewritten entirely, the ink newer than the parchment. She found entire family lines altered, heirship transferred between sons who never lived. In one genealogy, a concubine appeared and vanished within a single entry, her name rewritten 3 times in 3 different styles. Erasure had become a ritual. Each anomaly Mei Ling copied into her second ledger. She wrote carefully, in a plain, unobtrusive script, and folded each page into a silk bundle she hid within the lining of her work robes. No one searched her. Not yet. But the guards were changing, new faces, younger men, less ceremonial, more direct. Their uniforms bore no insignia. One morning she noticed one of them carried a scroll tucked beneath his belt. Not a weapon, not a command. A list, perhaps. She had seen those lists before. That night, she walked alone beneath the ginkgo trees along the western colonnade. The snow had stopped and the air was dry and brittle. Frost coated the leaves, turning every branch into a frozen lacework. As she turned a corner, she saw her shadow double. A figure stepped out from the alcove of a shrine. It was the older woman, the one from the Pavilion of Autumn Sighs, the one who had first spoken of memory and legacy. Her cloak was dark and unmarked, her hair now streaked with silver. "Walk with me," she said without greeting. Mei Ling followed, her hands tucked into her sleeves. "The Emperor is dying," the woman said after a long silence. "They won't announce it, not until they are ready. When they do, it will be a performance, a procession, but by then the truth will already have been buried." They passed a frozen pond where koi once swam beneath lotus leaves. Now it was still as glass. "What truth?" Mei Ling asked softly. "That there was a struggle," the woman replied. "That factions formed, that records were destroyed, that names were erased. That the empire did not simply continue, but was reshaped by shadows." They stopped beneath an arched bridge. No one else was near. "You've preserved what you could," the woman continued, "but preservation is not enough." Mei Ling turned to her. "Then what must I do?" The woman reached into her sleeve and handed Mei Ling a folded document. "Deliver this to the Pavilion of Clear Voices," she said, "before the morning bell sounds." "What is it?" "A ledger, one of many. It names the ones responsible." "Why me?" The woman smiled faintly. "Because you're still invisible to the ones who think they see everything." Before Mei Ling could speak again, the woman had stepped back into the dark, vanishing between the frost-covered trees like breath into cold air. Mei Ling returned to her quarters with the bundle pressed tightly beneath her arm. She lit no candle, fearing even the flicker of flame might betray her. Instead, she unwrapped the document by moonlight. It was smaller than she expected, tightly written, every inch of parchment filled. Some names she recognised, ministers, court scribes, high consorts. Others were unfamiliar, yet marked with symbols of power: lion, crane, peach blossom. One name was circled, not in ink, but in a faint red pigment that smeared at the touch. The pavilion named in the message, Clear Voices, was a ceremonial archive, rarely used. A place where scribes read aloud the histories of previous dynasties for record keepers. Few went there now. She would have to reach it before sunrise. She dressed in silence, taking only the necessary layers. She wrapped the document inside her inner robe, near her skin. Then she stepped into the dark, closing the door behind her without a sound. The palace was asleep, or pretending to be. Snow muffled her steps. The corridors echoed only with wind. Once she passed a guard post, but no one stirred. The brazier there had gone cold. When she reached the pavilion of clear voices, she paused beneath its stone arch. The doors were closed, not locked. She stepped inside, breath visible in the dim light. The hall was empty. Scrolls lined the walls, untouched. In the center stood the recitation platform, an old wooden structure where scribes once read aloud from the edicts of emperors long turned to ash. Meiling approached it. She unwrapped the document with trembling hands and laid it upon the platform. There was no ceremony, only the cold. She bowed once, not to the past nor to the future, but to the moment. Then she turned and left the document behind. As she stepped back into the freezing dawn, the first sound of the morning bell echoed across the palace. Low, distant, the emperor was dead. The bell tolled 12 times. Its sound rolled over the rooftops like fog, slow, heavy and absolute. It did not ask for attention. It demanded it. Every courtyard froze. Every conversation died mid-sentence. Even the birds, long accustomed to the routines of the palace, fell still in the trees. The emperor was dead. The official decree followed soon after. It arrived not as a sudden outcry, but as a carefully orchestrated procession. Robed officials bearing tablets of jade, eunuchs in white leading oxen draped in silk, women scattering petals of chrysanthemum, not for mourning, but for restraint, for dignity. Every corner of the palace was touched by the announcement, even those hidden far from the ceremonial halls, the repositories, the kitchens, the weaving rooms. Even Meiling's chamber, silent and modest, bore witness as a pair of pages knocked once and left behind a strip of mourning cloth and a folded prayer sheet. No explanations, no questions. It was done. That morning, Meiling sat by her table, the half-open fan seal placed beside her, its jade dark in the grey light. She did not cry, she did not smile. She wrapped the mourning cloth around her sleeve, tied it once and waited. Outside, a new current had begun to flow, not yet a tide, but enough to stir the stillness. Lady Huarong returned to the centre of court life like a candle reignited. She wore layers of white and pale violet, her voice measured, her glances sharper than ever. She did not speak of the emperor, she did not speak of the future, but she moved with purpose, and those who watched her adjusted their steps accordingly. The Empress Dowager, long unseen, appeared at last on the terrace of the Hall of Supreme Harmony. Her hair was coiled into a mourning crown, and her face was veiled, not in grief, but in command. When she lifted her hand, the guards knelt. When she turned away, no one dared breathe. Meiling watched all of this unfold from a distance. She was not summoned to any ceremony. She was not invited to the memorial rites. She walked to the Imperial repository as usual, past the same guards, and sat at the same table. But she felt the change. In the way her scrolls were now delivered late, in the way no one lingered to speak with her, in the way her name was no longer mentioned, but no one forgot to acknowledge her presence. Then, one afternoon, a familiar voice broke the quiet. "You placed the ledger where it needed to be." Meiling looked up. The older woman stood by the entrance, robed in mourning, her eyes watchful. "The document is gone," she said, "taken before first light." "By whom?" Meiling asked. "Someone who will not say their name." A long pause passed between them. "You've done your part," the woman added. Meiling shook her head. "It was never just one part," the woman offered a faint smile. "No, it never is." She stepped forward and handed Meiling a new scroll, sealed in wax the colour of smoke. "Read this, memorize it, then burn it." Meiling waited until she was alone. The scroll contained a directive, not official, not royal. It bore the signature of no known faction, yet the language was precise, deliberate. It described the formation of a quiet council, unnamed, unseen, whose task was not to rule but to recall. A group that would pass down not decrees but memories. A network hidden within the palace, not to preserve power but to witness its cost. A circle of remembrance. At the bottom was her name, not as a messenger, not as a servant, as a keeper. She burned the scroll that night, and the wax hissed softly as it met the flame. The following week she was transferred once more, not demoted, not promoted, simply reassigned. She now oversaw a section of the palace library dedicated to ceremonial correspondence. Dull work, in theory. Yet, beneath the routine, she found traces of what had been hidden. Patterns in the language, changes in the handwriting, the way certain scrolls mirrored others written decades earlier, the way silence echoed louder through repetition. Each evening, she continued her private ledger. She wrote by moonlight, no longer just fragments but full entries, observations, names, shifts in behaviour. She documented the slow unravelling of one era and the quiet stitching of another. Not to accuse, not to glorify, to remember. And always she wore the seal, not as a badge but as a promise. One morning, while shelving newly transcribed letters from the Empress Dowager's council, she discovered an envelope resting in the crease of a book's spine. It bore no seal, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Lady Huarong. Memory is the only power that cannot be taken by force. Let the ones who speak the loudest forget this. But let us not. Beneath the lines, a single drop of ink, deliberate, circular, like a tear not yet wept. Mei Ling folded the note and placed it among her ledger pages. She did not respond. She didn't need to. The snow returned briefly, softening the rooftops once more, but within the palace spring had already begun to stir. Not in flowers, not in birdsong, but in the way people moved, faster, lighter, as though waiting for new names to rise and old ones to fade. Mei Ling did not chase either. She remained exactly where she was, watching, recording, preserving, a quiet woman in a quiet chamber with ink-stained sleeves and stories that no decree could erase. The wind shifted again, though this time it carried no snow. It was the kind of wind that moved without sound, brushing past the silk banners that hung listless in the high corridors, stirring the dust on shrine floors long undisturbed. A spring wind, but cautious, as though it did not yet trust the sun's return. Within the Forbidden City, time had resumed its rhythm, but slower. Mourning banners still hung from the palace gates, though their edges had begun to fray. The emperor's death, once spoken in whispers, had become a shadow stitched into every hall, acknowledged not with grief, but with a change in tone, in posture, in names spoken more softly. Mei Ling's role within the palace had stabilised. She now spent her days in the lower archives of the library, a place few visited and fewer understood. The shelves there were lined with records no longer deemed necessary, petitions never answered, memorials never delivered, poems composed in exile and never read aloud. But among them she found value. She began to categorise not by topic or time, but by intention, sorting those who wrote in desperation from those who wrote in defiance, those who pleaded and those who warned. And in doing so, she came to understand a deeper truth. The court's power did not lie solely in the decisions it made, but in the voices it chose to ignore. And now Mei Ling listened to those voices, not as a scribe, as their steward. On the surface, little changed. She still wore the plain robes of her station. She still walked the quieter paths. Her seal remained hidden, her ledger tucked in its compartment. But beneath the simplicity of her life lay a growing complexity, a widening circle of memory and message, of quiet exchange. Each week, new fragments arrived. A line of verse slipped between the pages of a registry, a slip of silk embroidered with half a proverb, a broken hairpin wrapped in parchment, its lacquer chipped, its base marked with a symbol too faint to see unless held to flame. From these, Mei Ling pieced together a map, not of places but of people. Women like her, working in different corners of the palace, some concubines, some attendants, some cloaked in titles that gave them visibility, and others buried so deep in anonymity that even eunuchs forgot their names. Together they remembered, not in meetings or gatherings, but in a network of intention, each woman a thread, each message a knot, and each record, preserved, copied or smuggled, a shield against forgetting. It was not resistance in the traditional sense. They did not fight, nor plot, nor conspire. They witnessed, they recalled. They ensured that the stories hidden beneath silken ceremony would remain long after the banners changed and the courtiers bowed to a different name. Then, on an ordinary morning, a new name did arrive. A proclamation read in the Hall of Governance and echoed across the courtyards. His radiance, the first son of heaven, now ascends the throne. May the dynasty endure. There was no fanfare. No dragon robes presented before the people. The new emperor, a nephew by blood, a son by decree, had already moved into the private quarters. His authority was not declared, but assumed. Mei Ling watched the announcement from a distance. She stood beneath the eaves of the library, hands folded as the flags were changed and the guards turned to face new banners. The court adjusted swiftly. Lady Huarong appeared again in new robes, silver grey with faint plum blossoms. Her mourning crown replaced with a pearl clasp, She walked with the same grace, but her words had shifted. Now she spoke of loyalty, of renewal, of legacy. And yet when she passed mailing that day, she did not speak. She only met her gaze and nodded once, an acknowledgement not of friendship or alliance, but of understanding. That night, Mei-ling found a small parcel beneath her bedding, a folded piece of vellum bound with a red string, no seal. Inside, a name, one she did not know. Beneath it, a symbol, the closed fan, now fully open, and a single phrase, "We begin with what they forget." The next day, she asked a question aloud for the first time. She was seated across from a junior scribe in the library, a girl barely 16, careful with her ink, but full of curiosity. Mei-ling handed her a scroll, and as the girl took it, Mei-ling asked quietly, "Do you know who wrote the records of the last empress before she fell?" The girl blinked, surprised. "No, Lady Mei-ling? Would you like to?" The girl hesitated, then nodded. And with that, Mei-ling passed her the first of many forgotten names, beginning a quiet apprenticeship in the art of remembrance. She was not alone anymore. The network grew, slowly and intentionally. In the months that followed, Mei-ling trained 3 more scribes, all women, all quiet, all chosen not for ambition, but for their ability to listen. They learned how to copy without altering, how to hide a message in the corner of a page, how to trace the past not just through dates, but through silences. And still, the empire changed. Edicts were reissued, policies rephrased. The Empress Dowager appeared less and less, her place slowly receding into the shadows. The new emperor spoke often of clarity and control. His ministers wore emblems of reform. The peach blossom faction withered. The lion was rarely seen. But Mei-ling's ledger remained, and so did she. Not exalted, not disgraced, simply present. A woman of ink and memory, walking softly through a world that had not yet learned how much she had seen. The summer came late that year. It slipped into the palace like a shy visitor, hesitant at first, then unrelenting. The air thickened with heat, curling the corners of paper scrolls and clinging to the walls like damp breath. Cicadas returned to the gardens, their chorus rising and falling in waves, as if echoing the quiet rhythms of a city that never truly slept. In the northern courtyards, the ginkgo trees bore new leaves, pale green, delicate, full of promise. And still, the Forbidden City endured. Within its deepest halls, Mei-ling remained. She had grown older in ways that had nothing to do with time. Her hair was still dark, her hands still steady, but there was something different in her gait, a kind of stillness that moved with her, like the hush of falling snow. She was no longer watched, nor was she forgotten. She had become something else, a fixture, a part of the palace too quiet to remove, too enduring to ignore. Her days now passed in a rhythm of her own making. In the mornings, she tended to the library, overseeing the transcriptions of decrees and ceremonial documents. By afternoon, she reviewed the older records, some legitimate, others hidden within false covers or beneath misleading titles. And each evening, when the courtyards emptied and the lanterns flickered against the dusk, she sat by her desk and wrote, not in the official ledgers, not for any emperor, but for the ones who had no scrolls bearing their names, the concubine who disappeared one winter's night, the cook who delivered messages in folded napkins, the eunuch who spoke only once and paid for it in silence, the consort who bore a child that history would never mention. They were not forgotten, not here. Her ledger had grown thick now, more than parchment. It had become a map of loss and endurance, and yet it was not a record of despair. It was a testament to those who had lived behind the brocade, behind the boughs and silks and perfumed evenings, to those who had borne the weight of a world that only saw them when they smiled. The circle she trained continued their work, quietly, faithfully. They had no name, no seal, they needed none. One warm evening, as the moon rose over the western towers, Mei-ling received a visitor. She heard the knock, 3 soft taps, and opened her chamber door to find a girl no older than 17 standing there, holding a scroll tied with gold thread. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "I was told to bring this to the woman who remembers." Mei-ling said nothing. She took the scroll, nodded once, and invited the girl inside. They sat together in silence for a while. The girl sipped water from a porcelain cup, her eyes darting over the modest furnishings, the old books, the single lotus painting that hung above the desk. It was not a room of power, but it felt like truth. I don't want to be a wife, the girl said suddenly, or a petal in someone's garden. I want to remain. Mei Ling studied her. The girl's robe was fine, her hair neatly pinned. A new concubine, freshly chosen, likely still searching for the emperor's gaze, still unsure of how much of herself would be left if he looked. You will remain, Mei Ling said, but not in the way you think. She reached for her second ledger, the one not meant for display, and slid it across the table. There is more to remember than your own name. The girl opened the cover. Read the first few lines. Her expression changed, not to surprise, but recognition, as if she'd always known there were truths beneath the surface, but never been permitted to see them. Will you teach me? She asked. Mei Ling nodded. That night, the ledger welcomed a new hand. In the months that followed, the court shifted again. The young emperor announced reforms. Edicts once concealed were rewritten and reissued. Officials with long histories were quietly removed, their influence fading like ink in rain. The Empress Dowager was seen no more, and rumours of her failing health were met with bowed heads and blank expressions. The palace moved on, but beneath its polished floors and red lacquered beams, the quiet work continued. New messages arrived. Tiny bundles of silk, carved tokens, scraps of memory sewn into the lining of ceremonial garments, a hair ribbon with initials embroidered in reverse, a jade comb with a crack down its centre, a spoon that did not match its set. Each was catalogued, each was placed in a hidden alcove within the private wing of the library, a place no one knew existed but those who had been shown. And then one morning, Mei Ling received a letter. It came not by official courier, but with a tray of preserved plums from the southern provinces. Tucked beneath the cloth was a slip of paper, worn and delicate. It bore the mark of the closed fan, now fully unfurled, every spoke revealed. The letter read, "There are no more names to erase. What remains is now memory, and memory, once carried, becomes inheritance." She folded the letter carefully. Then she stood, crossed to the hidden compartment behind her shelves, and placed it beside the first ledger she had ever kept. That night, Mei Ling walked the palace grounds alone. The lotus ponds were still, their surface smooth as lacquer. The lanterns glowed softly against the evening haze. Above her, the stars shimmered with the same indifference they had always held. But Mei Ling was no longer indifferent. She paused beside the eastern shrine, where the stone lions watched over the courtyard with silent vigilance. And there, she whispered a name, just one, into the dark. No one heard her, no one needed to. It was enough that she remembered.